Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by 13 Days to Remarkable Leadership, a free leadership video series based on Kevin's book, Remarkable Leadership. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/13 days. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
You probably think that experimenting is a good thing, but can we be an experimental leader? I mean, isn't leadership too important to experiment with? I mean, my guest today says it isn't too important and that we should all strive to be experimental leaders. I will introduce you to her in a second and then we'll dive in. But before that, welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. By the way, you can get if you're here on the live, you can get all future episodes and therefore interact with us and see all of them sooner, in this case, by like 3 months sooner, by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, depending on where you happen to choose. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkable.com/LinkedIn to do that. And while you're here, if you're joining us live, just imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee, or in my case, a cup of tea. Just share your questions, your comments, and ideas, and they will make for a better conversation and hopefully a better podcast episode down the road. And for all of you watching listening to or watching the podcast later, you just go ahead and join us in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. If you work remotely and want to be more effective, more productive, more engaged, and more connected, this book will help you get there, because there's a big difference between working from home and being an engaged and effective remote teammate. You can learn more and get your copy at longdistanceteammate.com. You can even get a sample chapter, longdistanceteammate.com. And with that, let me introduce to you my guest. Let me bring her in here. There she is. There is Miss Melanie. Let me tell you about her, and then we'll dive in. Melanie Parish is the creator of the Experimental Leader Program and a master certified coach, an expert in problem solving, constraints management, operations, strategic hiring, and brand development. Her clients include the Fortune 50, global IT companies, CXOs, senior leaders, and entrepreneurs. She's the author of the book, The Experimental Leader. You can see it over her shoulder. Be a new kind of boss to cultivate an organization of innovators. And we'll be diving into that in just a second. But first of all, Melanie, greetings and welcome. I'm glad that you're here.
Hey, Kevin, I am so glad to be here and super excited to talk to you about leadership.
Well, that is one of my favorite topics. And so we're going to talk about that for sure. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you end up being focused on leadership? How did you end up writing a book, about leadership? Tell us a little bit about all that.
Sure. Bless you. And, yeah, so my background was always in sales and marketing. And in my early days as a coach, people kept hiring me because they wanted to grow their businesses. And then my clients have stayed with me a long time. And as they grew their businesses, they started to have more production challenges, more employee challenges, more leadership challenges. And so I sort of grew into the coach I needed to be. And I started working, 6 or 7 years ago. I started working with an IT consulting firm in the States, and started working with them on and learning some of their processes, and really diving into some of the Japanese manufacturing concepts like constraints management and some of the tools for that. And I started to realize there was a real way to lead innovation that's different than sort of our old-fashioned top-down hierarchical models of leadership. And I realized there was a real space. People get good at experimenting, and that can happen at any stage in the organization. But I realized that there's a way to sort of lead experimenting, lead holding those processes, lead a culture of experimentation. And, sometimes you just get a calling in your career. And the Experimental Leader, that title, that book, it just grabbed me and hung on to me for 7 years while I wrote it.
And you couldn't let go of it.
it was like, I wanted it out there. I wanted people to learn how to do those concepts. I wanted to grapple with it and to help other people grapple with it too.
And as I said before, you can see the book cover over Melanie's shoulder. You can't see one in my hand because I only had digital. So I can't, normally I would hold it up and show it to y'all. So Melanie, you really are saying, and by the way, we are both fans of the theory of constraints and the goal. I know you're far more knowledgeable of it than I am because you're like certified and all that stuff, but I'm a big fan. I remember when I first read the book, I couldn't put it down years ago.
Yeah.
And so The Goal is the name of the book, everybody. And Goldratt is his last name, correct?
Eliyahu Goldratt. He was an Israeli physicist, and he worked in manufacturing a lot. But his theory of constraints is one of the most powerful pieces of thought leadership, I think, in our century, or, in the last century, I guess, at this point.
Yeah. Well, we are all getting older, and we are now 21 years into the new century, Melanie, just saying. So you told us a little bit sort of how you ended up here, but this idea of experimenting is where I started. I said, really, this is important, like, experimenting here. So talk to us a little bit about what you would call the scientist's approach to leadership. Talk about that.
Yeah. And every leader who's listening is going to know this space. There's a point where you want to change something in your organization and you start to think, what could I do? And that is the moment that's the moment I would call when an experiment is born. And leaders live and die by these ideas, but that's the thing I think that's broken in our organizations. And so when we think, I want to change something by trying something, that's the moment that we want to think to ourselves, okay, great. What am I going to try? What's the experiment? And then what data am I going to collect? And how am I going to know if that thing that I tried is working or not? And that's the heart of the experiment. And I think if we have agreement in organizations that we're experimenting, then we don't have to kill the leader whose experiment doesn't work. All we're doing is collecting data and deciding together what the next experiment is that we try.
Yeah, see, so that's what I love that, because, I know that the idea experimental leader captured you, and it's certainly a great brand and all that. And yet when you said it there, but someone's going to say, well, I don't want to experiment, but that's all you're doing when you try.
We have to.
Yeah, we have to.
I feel like this year's been like the Olympics for experimenting.
Well, we didn't have an Olympics. So we all had an Olympics, apparently.
Yeah. Well, and you look at the leaders, like, New Zealand experimented extraordinarily well. The US, maybe not so much. Canada's somewhere in the middle. So every country, it's like the leaders of every country have been, trying different things. And then slowly best practices have been emerging. But we don't have best practices for a pandemic. So it's been an interesting time to see how people experiment.
Okay. So I love the fact that you brought up the idea of a best practice, right? So, okay. So I try. So where does your experimental approach come in when we talk about, okay, I can try something, but what about when I go out and research and find other people's best practices, et cetera, et cetera? How does that all hook together in your thinking?
I think that's a really interesting question. So, like with my little team that I run, in my organization, we are very intentional about when are we trying something new? When are we innovating? And when are we looking to see what's already worked? And we have to be very clear about which one we're doing. So if we're experimenting, then everything's on the table. But if we've, say, hired a consultant who has a process that they're helping us implement, I am dogmatic about following their approach first to see if it will work. And we only experiment after we've tried the process.
Yeah, hypothetically, it's hypothetical, right? And so trying something is a really good way to go. Someone on LinkedIn has just added this comment about metrics. Metrics matter in science and leadership. Otherwise, we have nothing to draw upon. So when we make decisions about what's working and what's not. So talk about metrics in this methodology for just a second.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know what you're measuring. And I really think it's important to bound your experiment by time in some way. I love 24-hour experiments and 7-day experiments. So I like, what can you learn in 24 hours that you don't know right now? And how would you test it? So in order to do that, you have to do some really specific things. You have to prototype. You can't take $1 million budget and implement it. And so that prototyping really helps you get data fast. What can you paste together? And if you're thinking about, like, in a world of automations, for example, you may not want to automate everything. You may want to just manually try something to see if it works before you spend $1 million on an automation.
Or even 3 days. Like, you know, I mean, on our team, it wouldn't take $1 million to try hardly anything. But the point here is, and I love this idea of the 7 days or the 24 hours, but take the 7 days. Like, if we're going to only have 7 days to test it, we can't take 4 days to build the thing. We got to prototype and go, you know, duct tape and cardboard, right? We got to get it out today. We got to get started. And I love that idea. I really do love that idea. So when I started, before I actually introduced you, Melanie, I asked a question that I'm guessing that you get asked often. Okay, so experimenting can lead to failure, right? So if experimenting leads to failures, like, isn't this job a little too difficult or too important as a leader to have a bunch of failures? And we don't want our teams, like, what's your take on failure here?
So there's like big F failure and little f failure. And I'm a huge fan of the little f failure because it gives us information. And usually the big F failures happen because you tried to do too much and go too far with too much budget. It's probably a failure of not prototyping and gathering information quick enough. Because if you get little failures, then you can change real quick. And then you're going to try something else, which is going to help you avoid the big F failure. The big F failure that gets you released into the wild from your job.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, we could talk about product or whatever you're talking about, a prototype, but here's the thing. Let's go something simple. You may say, I want to drastically change the way my virtual meetings run. Well, okay, awesome. But you don't have to, like, start from zero. You can do some little F, right? Little T, try something, and maybe you get a little F failure, right? No big deal. Next meeting, you do something different. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about here?
Absolutely. So, like, one thing you might want to try with your meetings, if you have meeting fatigue, you might say to everyone, I'm trying a new experiment this week. I'm only going to do 15-minute meetings. I'm going to leave a 15-minute gap afterward just in case we have to go over, but we're going to really try to go for 15 minutes. And then the next week, if that didn't work, you're going to try standing. So you're going to just say, I'm trying to make our meetings really effective. Everybody wants this. Everybody wants effective meetings. So, we're going to time box our check-in. Like, we're going to do a check-in in 30 seconds, and we're really going to stick to that because we want to make everyone really productive. I meet with my assistant, my tech person, daily for 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes. We get so much done. It's crazy what we get done because it's fast. And all we're doing, because we meet so frequently, all we have to do is figure out what we're doing for the day. Yep.
Because you have a cadence, you have a rhythm that says we're going to do it again tomorrow. So we don't have to, everyone on my team keeps everyone that reports to me directly, keeps what they call the Kevin list. Like, when I talk to Kevin, and it isn't, in most cases, it's not every day, but when it is, like, we're ready to rock and roll because they got a list. Here's my list for Adrian later today. Right. So, like, ready. If she's watching right now, she's going, oh crap, Kevin's got a list.
Oh no, there's a list.
Yeah. But she already knows that I have a list. She also knows that she has a list, and I know she has a list. And by the way, here's what I've learned. You got to start with their list. Right? Because if you don't, you got to start with your team members' list.
Most important question in leadership, I think, is what do you need from me to do your work today?
Yeah,
absolutely. The most important.
What do you need? How can I?
What do you need from me? How do I get out of your way? What bottlenecks can I help you remove? What's in your way that I can help you with to get your work done?
There's a whole chapter in the book about bottlenecks, and it wasn't even on my list, but why don't we just talk about that for a second?
Yeah,
So
that's all theory of constraints stuff. Like
I
that's
know it is, but not everyone
Yeah.
on the call knows. I mean, watching this knows that. So talk about bottlenecks just for a sec. Why don't you?
Yeah, so there's always one bottleneck for whatever your big goal is. There's really only one bottleneck. And if you think, no, Melanie, you're, full of crap, that's not true, I have lots of bottlenecks, you're lying to yourself. So if you can learn, and when I talk about bottlenecks, it's the constriction to flow to help you get to throughput, to get you to produce work. So there's only ever one bottleneck. So what is it?
Right.
At a time. As soon as you remove that one, there's only one bottleneck.
Right.
But there will be another one. There's always a next one. There's always a constriction to flow. As a leader, you have lots of work you have to do to help all the, extra things happen, like social media. Social media is never the bottleneck, but it is part of the work. But you don't want to focus on it first because it's not the bottleneck. It's only part of the flow. Like it's part of the big picture. It's marketing, it's general, but it's never the bottleneck. So if you don't focus on the bottlenecks, you have many, many tasks. If you focus on the bottleneck, you only have one. And so it's a really good way to orient yourself as a leader as to what's important. Eliyahu Goldratt, who we talked about before, he always said that management attention was the biggest bottleneck in North America. I suspect it goes beyond North America.
I'm pretty confident that it goes beyond North America.
So it's so powerful. That focus is just so incredibly powerful. When you meet with your assistant, Adrienne, when you meet with her, you're removing bottlenecks by meeting with her.
So someone on LinkedIn said the most common bottleneck is human. Do you want to comment on that one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. We're always in our own way, but and past that is what's the throughput bottleneck. Sometimes we're bottlenecked by our own mindset. Sometimes we're bottlenecked by time. So as leaders, we're bottlenecked by either time or mindset or knowledge.
Yep.
And really, it's only one of those three things. So if you have a bottleneck, you need to solve it in one of those three ways.
Say them again so everyone gets them.
Time. You don't have enough time to do the work you need to do. Knowledge, you don't know how to do what you need to do. So you either can learn it or hire someone. And the third one is mindset. You don't believe you can do it. So you either need to deal with your own mindset or hire someone to do it.
I would humbly suggest to you all that the third one she mentioned is the most important of the three. Just saying. But I'll leave that for all of you to consider for yourself. So Melanie, I want to take us back to your whole idea of experimenting, trying. So how would you suggest that we conduct a leadership experiment?
Well, I love that you're asking, Kevin, but I want to back up just a second because, when I wrote this book, I knew experimenting was like the important concept in this book. And my editor just was like, you have to tell them how to conduct an experiment. Like they were like on me over and over. And it's in my book.
It is.
But it's not the most important part. So the most important part to adopt, and you can start today without any knowledge other than this podcast, like without anything else, you can start to say to your people, start to say to yourself, what's the experiment I'm going to try? What's the experiment you're going to try next? Oh, how long will it be? Like, when will we know if it works? How will we know if it works? That's all. It's just a mindset. Again, we're back to that mindset. If you adopt an experimental mindset, that's step one. If you really get all of your people talking about experimenting and you want to know how to roll out, continuous improvement experiments on a regular basis, and you want to track them on Kanban boards and have one-on-ones and meet with them, then read my book.
It's all in there, everybody.
But if you just want to change your culture, just start going into every meeting and saying, what's the experiment we're going to try? Because people know what this word means. They are able to easily adopt it. And what happens when you use this terminology is everybody breathes. They go, oh, we don't have to get it right. We're going to experiment. And what happens when people breathe and they relax is they start to open feedback loops and they start to discuss what they want to change and how they're going to change it and what they want to try. And all of this improves your leadership on day one because you're opening up the dialogue of your team because they're not so afraid
of you or of the process or of whatever, right? So
yeah,
for sure. So okay, you've made this so simple that the next question I have is almost seems like a non-question, but I believe it still is one. What keeps people from doing what you're suggesting? Like, what's the big resistor that you hear?
I think anytime a leader starts to think of introducing something new, it's a little scary. Like what they worry about risk, they worry how their boss will see it. They worry if people will laugh at them. They worry, it's really leadership is brave work. And to sort of go the gauntlet, so to speak, with a new idea is, and the research really bears this out. Like people go to weekends or trainings or learning days, and then they don't implement the learning. And I think there's a real edge to jump over for leaders. There's just like a little, bump over an edge to introduce new into their organizations because they won't be good at it in the beginning.
And everybody, here's the thing. When we're only worried about trying and small F failures, it is only an edge. It's only a bump. It's not a cliff. Yeah. We're not talking Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner here.
Yeah.
We're talking about take a step, right?
Yeah. That's why I say, like, start with the language. You could use that experimental language for 2 years before you actually start having any sort of big experiments that you're rolling out. Get people used to the language first. Then when you start to introduce things, number one, I hope you've been experimenting in your own life, with your kids, with your spouse, with your friends. How do you throw a good party is a great continuous improvement experiment. Collect data, see if it worked, see who showed up, see if you can improve it. There's practice things that you can try to just improve your experimenting on your own. But really, you'll get the biggest shift from just becoming experimental in the way you approach problem solving.
Here's the thing, everybody. So the question came in from LinkedIn, or the comment came in from LinkedIn, just to start with, let's try something. And I would say, ask someone on your team or ask yourself, what did I try today? What have I tried today? Which goes with one of my all-time favorite questions, which is, what did you learn today? And quite honestly, if you're not trying, you're probably not learning. Just saying. Now, there's another thing in your book that takes us to a slightly different place. It's connected to this, certainly, but it's something that I thought I'd have you, if you don't mind, talking about just for a couple minutes. And we don't have time to dive into all of them. But you talk about different types of leaders. And so again, we don't have time for all of them, but can you talk a little bit about this idea and maybe connect a couple of them, maybe a couple that you find show up the most, or that might most really need to hear what we're talking about?
Well, I think when we take on roles of leadership, and my husband and I actually had a conversation about this recently, and it was like, when we were in elementary school, we were like, they were trying to identify who the good leaders were. And there's no way you can identify a good leader because you don't have anything to do when you're in an elementary school. So you can't actually look to see how much work you produce. And so when they were identifying leaders in school, what they were looking for were sort of charismatic leaders and dominant leaders, like people who were dominant in their personality style or charismatic. But when we actually get tapped for a leadership role, usually because we're a really good individual contributor and someone goes, hey, you are so good at accounting.
You're going to be the accounting supervisor.
Yes. And then, I actually have a client in accounting, and we talked about this. It's like she spent, years going through undergrad and getting a finance MBA. And then she did that job for 1 year and got tapped to be a supervisor and never, had a leadership course. And she's like, how am I supposed to know all this? And so this is a really painful place. But I think when we start to get promoted, we start to look around for role models. And we're also enticed by that dominant leader, the bossy leader, or the charismatic leader. And in my book, I go through 8, I think it's 8. There's an unlimited number, but I think there's 8 reactive leadership styles. And these are strategies that I believe develop when we're children, when we're faced with fear, uncertainty, and chaos. They're the ways that we protect ourselves. And when we step into leadership, they become the reactive style that we assume to try to protect ourselves in that leadership role. And really, I just want a new way for leaders, because those are really painful. We're actually in our, reactive state, our lizard brain state, trying to be protective with any one of those strategies. And sometimes people will read my book and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm in all of these. and I call it strategy shopping. Like, you try being really bossy and that doesn't work. So you try being really charming. And if that doesn't work, then you try being really like a stickler to the rules, and you just kind of go through them. But I do find that if people can start to shed those reactive styles and start to lead more authentically, then that helps their leadership improve right away as well.
So, Melanie, I've got a number of questions that I ask almost everybody before we're finished. But before we do that, I want to give you one more sort of chance to say, is there something we didn't talk about that you would like to have talked about? Or is there something that maybe came up as we were going and I took us a different direction you'd like to come back to? What didn't we talk about?
Well, the only thing is I have a new leadership program that I've created for new leaders that I am just super excited about, because I think new leaders 0 to 3 years in are often in a lot of pain. They've gotten promoted. So if anybody is in those shoes, I'd love to chat with you to find out if our program's good for you, or to refer you to other programs. I think, Kevin, you've got a book around this as well. And
I'm
so
guessing
it's
just go to melanieparish.com. They could find that. They could do that, couldn't they?
Yes, they can find it there. And they can find it there. And I'd also love to give any of your listeners a copy of The Experimental Leader. And they can, it's a digital copy, but they can go to digitalbook.experimentalleader.com and get a free copy of my book. So I'd love to have them it is like magic.
It's like magic, everybody. Just because you're here on live, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, just because you're watching it at one of those places later, or if you're on the podcast. But see, here's the thing, everybody. If you're waiting for the podcast, you could have had this like 2 months earlier. Just saying. So I do have a couple of other questions, Melanie, for you before we go.
Sure.
And they're the ones I ask pretty much everybody. And here's the first one, not about work. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
What do you do for fun?
Oh my gosh, I'm a swimmer. I swim. So except right now we're in lockdown, like we're in total stay-at-home order, but I swim about 7.5 kilometers a week. And so I love swimming.
7.5 kilometers per minute. So Sabrina just said, can you repeat the address for the digital version?
Sure, absolutely. It's digitalbook.experimentalleader.com.
Experimentalleader.com. I told myself I'd get through this whole episode without saying experiential instead of experimental. And guess what?
Yeah, well, only one
was wrong. Okay. Yeah. So you're a swimmer. I love that. So what are you reading? And I know this is the only question, everybody, that I tell people ahead of time, and she scurried to her Audible. So I don't know if you're reading.
I had to look at Audible. Yeah. So I'm reading a book. Right now I'm reading a book called Her Name is Margaret, that a woman in Ontario wrote, that's about a homeless woman and her whole journey through her life and healthcare and everything else. So I'm reading that for book club. I'm reading Michelle Obama's Becoming, which I think is a really interesting book on leadership, actually. And I'm reading a book that's kind of dark, but amazingly vivid and interesting, called American Dirt. So those are the things I'm reading right now.
American Dirt was a bestseller. I don't remember now if that was in 19 or 20, but
I don't know.
American Dirt. Her Name is Margaret, and Becoming. You you're welcome, everybody, for adding to your reading list. So now I have a question for all of you. Before we wrap up, I have a question for all of you that are watching or listening, whether it's now or later. It's one of my very favorite questions. And the question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? Are you going to spend some time thinking about your bottlenecks and what they are and how to overcome them? Maybe it's mindset, maybe it's time, whatever. Are you going to think a little bit more about how you get yourself or your team to think about trying rather than waiting? Are you going to think about how you can create more small F failures? I don't know. My question to you is, what are you going to take from this other than a smile because you enjoyed the last 30 minutes? None of this matters, everybody, unless you take action. And I know, although I've only known you for a short while, Melanie, I know that you and I share this thought that at the end of the day, we got to do something. We got to try something if we're going to have any chance of making this work. And so one more chance. Where can people find out more about you? I know they can go here to Melanie Parish. Where do you want to point people to find and want more about what you're up to?
I think the book is the best way. It gets you on my list. It gets you digitalbook.experimentalleader.com. Go get a freebie. But also then you'll hear about all our programs we'll send you some emails and tell you about us too.
Everybody, that's a wrap for today. We're so glad that you've been here. We're so happy that you chose to join us. Today's episode was brought to you by The Long Distance Teammate, our new book. You can learn more and get a sample chapter. I guess I'm not as nice as Melanie. I'm only giving you a chapter, not the whole book. It's probably because of my publisher. But anyway, thelongdistanceteammate.com. You can learn more there. And we'll be back next week here on wherever you're watching us. If you're live next week for the first time, I won't be at noon Eastern. I'll be at 7 p.m. Eastern because I'll be in the studio recording a new course at noon with a client, with a partner. But I'll be here at 7 p.m. next week. But if you're on the podcast, it's every week. And I'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you all soon.